Rabbeisai, welcome back. Let's do this. Okay, we're learning the sugya of Tinok Shenishba, Mummer, Mechallel Shabbos b'far Hesya. Who counts like a Jew? Who counts like a guy? When could you rely on them? When can you not? Let's get involved. There are many halachas in the Torah, many mitzvahs, many averos that it says these mitzvahs apply to Amcha. This is to your people, to the people who are part of your nation. Or sometimes the Torah says achicha. This mitzvah or this avera applies specifically to achicha, your brother. And as Chazal often say, achicha b'mitzvahs, your brother in mitzvahs. Who counts and who doesn't count? These halachas of achicha and amecha generally do not apply to those who rebelled against Yiddishkeit. A mummer, a kaifer, somebody who rebels against Yiddishkeit, they are no longer part of amecha, they are no longer part of achicha. They've left the fold, seemingly, and these halachas would not apply. Now we're going to see it's a little complicated which halachas fit into this category, and it's also a little bit debatable which type of person fits into this klal, this category, and which type of person does not fit into this category. So I started putting together a list of mitzvahs or averos that this is a halachic question, and this is debatable who it applies to and who it doesn't. And I couldn't believe it. My pen kept on writing. I came up with a list of like 30 things, and I think it's an incomplete list. So it is really, I was amazed by how important and how applicable this topic is. Tremendous ramifications. Number one, we're going to have to discuss this person, this mummer, or potentially Tinok Shenishba, as we'll explain what that means in a minute. Do they count as a minion when it comes to Davar Kedusha? Namely, Baruch Hu Kaddish Kedusha. Do they count as a minion when it comes to Tefillah B'Tzibur? Could you count them in a zimun? Can they get a aliyah Torah? Can they get a aliyah for the Sefer Torah? Could you give them hagba and psicha? Could they write a letter of the Sefer Torah Tefillah Mezuzah? You know that awkward thing, you're giving the Sefer Torah, and you know that uncle who's not exactly so from shows up. Oh, what are you guys doing here? Oh, writing letters? Oh, could I write a letter? Is that okay or is that not okay? You know, your Reform rabbi great uncle wants to write you tefillin. Is that okay or is that not okay? Shchita, could he do shchita, this guy? If he touches wine, is it asur al stam yainim, which is what some people call yain nesach a little bit incorrectly? Is he allowed to give edus? Do we trust him for edus? Does he have nemanis? Are we mechallel Shabbos to save his life? Does he ruin an eruv? There's a concept that a guy who you don't rent the space from ruins the eruv. If you know what I'm talking about in Hilchos Eruv, great. If not, don't worry about it. Does he ruin the eruv? Does he count as to be one of the 10 to make something a rabim, to make even a mitzvah kala yarg val yaver? Once again, if you know that what halach I'm talking about, great. Do you have to return a lost object to him? Is he included in v'haftal recha kamecha? Do you have to love him? Are you allowed to speak lashon hara about him? Can you hate him? Do you have to be danim l'kav schus? Is there an isser of einos dvarim on him? Do you have to give him tzedakah? Does pidyon shvuyin apply to him? I'm not going to get too involved in that one. Loi sakim, is there isur nakama? Loi sater, is there saying, oh, I'm gonna give it to you like you didn't give it to me the other day? Does that apply to one of these people? Is there a mitzvah techacha? Are you allowed to lend him money beribis? If this person has a relative who's a kayin, are they allowed to be mitama for him to bury him? Is there kavod meis b'chal? If he makes kiddush, are you yotze kiddush with his kiddush? When he cooks something, is there isser of bishul akum? So that is just like 30 different nafkaminas that I just put the right. I'm not going to be able to get into each one specifically, but I'm going to lay out the klolim, and then we're going to go back and go through some of the interesting ones on a specific level, but I'm not going to be able to get into every last one. Now, before we get into the super details, let's understand a little bit of history, because a little bit of history will make us understand when this issue came up and who talks about it. Let's go. So it's true there were some concepts of off the derech or not our derech people as far back as Mizman and Rishonim. There were the Karoyim, the Karaites, who the Rambam discusses whether they have a din of a mummer or not. But Pashtus, they do have a din of a mummer, and that's one discussion. But after that, this discussion is not a big play discussion because it was pretty obvious. A mummer was a mummer. Up until 250 years ago, everybody was fundamentally from. Some people knew more and some people knew less. Some people were more machmir in halacha, some people were more mekel in halacha. But overall, there was no community of Jews that weren't shomer Torah mitzvahs. Once again, some people were better, some people were worse. But there's no community of non-shomer Torah mitzvahs. Except maybe, without getting too involved, the Moranos, but that was a little bit of a complicated story because they were kind of forced not to keep things in public, and they ended up, a lot of them, losing some of their tradition. But that wasn't a shita to go against. It was more a circumstance. But I guess there is room to debate about that. But excluding that time, and I think in Portugal there was a similar story a little bit later, but outside of that, there was no major movement of not being shomer Torah mitzvahs. Now, there was always individuals who left the fold. Individuals that didn't like this Yiddishkeit thing, dropped Yiddishkeit, moved somewhere, married a guy, and acted like a guy. Those people clearly had the din mummer. And there was nothing to debate about it. They were a mummer. That was what a mummer was. And that's an obvious sugya. And all the halachas that I just went through, they come out, all of them do not apply to that guy. He doesn't have a din yid. He has a din like a guy. Because you have a general klal, we see in Gemaras, we see throughout Shulchan Aruch, a mummer has a din like a guy, l'chol davar. Okay. So, now, 250 years ago, started the Haskalah. So the Haskalah was the original first movement of people who we're Jewish, we're still Jewish, we just don't keep halacha. Or maybe it started with certain halachas. There was always people that didn't keep halacha, but not b'shita. It's just they happen maybe not to be so righteous. So these people started not keeping halacha, they had a din mumarim. And that this first generation that went off, they had a din mummer just like the past people had a din mummer. The fact that there were a lot of people doing it together, that didn't really change anything. Where the question gets more interesting and a little more complicated is, what about their children? Okay. So let's put that aside. We're going to go through some examples, and then we're going to get back to that basic question. So who counts for a minyan? So you need 10 adult Jewish men who count for a minyan. Now, there's a concept that we see, as we quoted already, that a mummer, somebody who rebels, or a kaifer, is considered like a non-Jew for everything. It's like a goy l'chol davar. So it is considered like a non-Jew regarding everything. Now, we see that a Mechallel Shabbos b'far Hesya has a din mummer who has a din guy, which means if A equals B and B equals C, so A equals C. Mechallel Shabbos b'far Hesya has a din like a guy l'chol davar. Now the Shulchan Aruch and Or Chaim Siman Nunhei says that someone who does Averis counts for a minyan, or Vayin. Somebody who does Averis, he counts for a minyan. The Mishnah Berurah, in line with the Magen Avram, quoting the Pri Megadim, explains that din of the Shulchan Aruch is only true by a mumar l'teavon, somebody that does averos because it's geschmack. Why did they eat that cheeseburger? Because a cheeseburger is geschmack. Why did they look at something inappropriate? Because they enjoyed it. It's somebody who did averos because they enjoyed it. That is who we're talking about, that they still count for a minyan. However, a mumar lahachas, somebody who's dafka not keep something, whether it's a shita, or whether it's a shita, whether it's I'm going to show you, whether it's I'm dafka going against something, he's a mumar lahachas. Such a person, Zak the Mishnah Brura, once again working with the Pri Megadim and the Magen Avram, says that such a person does not count for a minyan. He's a mummer and treated like a non-Jew. Now comes along Moshe Feinstein and he argues. He has a big chiddush, and Moshe Feinstein wasn't scared to argue when he felt he was right. And Moshe argues in the Mishnah Brura, the Pri Megadim, and the Magen Avram. He takes them all on. And he says like this, wait a second. What is the makar of a minyan requiring 10? So the makar is, it says, Niktashti b'soich Yisrael. And you should become kaddish from amongst Yisrael. Niktashti, a davar shebekadusha, needs b'soich. What's b'soich? So we have a Gezer Shava that we learn. Might be a Gila Milsa, but it's probably a Gezer Shava. Soich from Kairach. That teaches that a Davar Shebekadusha needs 10 because we learned Soich from Kairach. Because by Kairach it says B'Toich Ha'ida Hazeh. And we learn from the Toich of Kairach to the Toich of V'netashti. Okay, but where do you see 10 by Kairach? Kairach, he gets it. Kairach gets it from the Meraglim, because by Kairach it says Eda, by the Meraglim it says Eda. So just like the Meraglim were 10, so too we transfer Eda to Kairach. The sugya of Kairach is 10, and then we have a double transfer from the sugya of Kairach to V'netashti 10, 10, 10, and the choo-choo train grows from the Meraglim to Minktashti, Davar Shel Kedusha, that you need 10 for Davar Shel Kedusha. Wait, I thought there were 12 Nesiim, right? No. Well, Yeshua and Kalev didn't count, because Yeshua and Kalev were the good guys. So the Eda was referring to the 12 minus 2. 12 minus 2 is 10, and that's how we have 10 by the Meraglim. So it's a little bit of a complicated cheshbon, but by the time you're all done, we were learning from the Meraglim that you need 10. Dr. Moshe Feinstein, Chazal tell the Meraglim were koifrim. The Chazal tell us that they said Hashem cannot defeat the people of this land. Hashem can't. It's like a Baal Abayis who can't take the kelim out of his house. HaKadosh Baruch Hu cannot, Chas Shalom to say such, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu cannot defeat the people of the land. And to say such a thing is kfirah. So the Meraglim are koifrim. If the source of minyan is from koifrim, obviously koifrim count for a minyan. It can't be that the source of the minyan is koifrim and koifrim don't count. It doesn't make sense. So it's Moshe, even a Mechallel Shabbos for Fesya, or a koifer, counts as a minyan. Now there's an interesting point where most people who quote this from Moshe don't bother reading it and don't realize. There, Moshe, he says something interesting. He says they count for a minyan, and it works for a davar sheb kedusha, like Kaddish, Kedusha, Baruch Hu. But he says it's still not tefillah b'tzibur. This guy is, even if he's reading from a siddur, that's not called davening when a kofer reads from a siddur. That's called reading a book in Hebrew when a kofer reads from a siddur. That's not tefillah. And therefore, if it's not tefillah, you don't have tefillah b'rabim. And once again, Ramesh, just as a side point, the thing, could we daven with 6 and the other 4 people mitzvah or whatever? Ramesh wasn't down for that. So he didn't like that idea in general. He held it doesn't work. So therefore, you don't have 10 who are davening. You don't have a minyan. So, this happened recently a lot of time. We're in the miklat. We have 10 men in the miklat. We might as well, when the bombs were falling from Iran, we might as well just daven Ma'ariv once we're here, right? we have 9 from guys, and we have a couple of Chalainim. Could we daven? So, once again, we might get other heterim of Chalainim, maybe of Tinok Shenishba, we'll discuss later. But assuming we're not going with that Tinok Shenishba heter, and the Mechallel Shabbos for Hasya, Zater Moshe, you want them to answer a Kaddish, and you want to make a siyum, and you want them to answer Kaddish, because then to hate, go for it. But when it comes to actually Tefillah B'tzibur, they don't count. And a lot of people do not know that point. Fine. Now, there are 3 ways, Moshe just took on the Mishnah Brura, the Magen Avram, and the Pri Megadim. How are we going to deal with Moshe's proofs? It seems like a pretty strong proof. So there's 3 ways to deflect Moshe's proof. One way is, we're only learning the Gezeir Shava to tell you the number, not the character of the Meraglim. It's the number. It's just simple fact. 10, 10, 10. That's all that we're transferring. We're not transferring the character of the Meraglim. However, it's a little bit difficult, because as Rav Yashiv actually points out in defending Rav Moshe's Raya, he says there's a Gemara where by Rav Yirmiyah asks, when it is back to the sugya of when it's Yarg Val Yaver to do a certain Averis before Hestia without getting too involved. And he asked, is 9 Jews and 1 guy counted as public in order to affect those halachas? And the Gemara answers, no, because what are we learning it from? We learn it from the Meraglim. The Meraglim were all Jews. So you see, this idea of Rabbim, you must be all Jewish. So you see, we are factoring in some element of who they were. Now, you could be mechalik and say we're factoring in who they were Jewish, but we're not factoring in their quality traits. It's possible to split the pie. It's possible to split it, but it's not a simple split. Pashas is you either are just doing the number, or you're taking the full picture of who they are. But there is room to be mechalik. Possibility number 2 to deflect Rav Moshe's Raya is, were the Meraglim really kaifrim? The Chavetz Chaim in Shmir Saloshin says that the Meraglim, they were at Tzadikim Gemurim, they were in the Siyim, Sanhedrin listened to them. They couldn't have been kaifrim. Oh, so what's Pshat? Because the way that the Chazal describe what they said, they sound like kaifrim. So what's Pshat? So perhaps Pshat is like this, that this is what the Chavetz Chaim says, that they weren't really kaifrim. It was a small avera on their level. They were on a very high level. When you're on a high level, you get judged in a very fine way. And they made a small avera. What was their small avera? They said, us Klal Yisrael, we did the egel. We've been complaining right and left in the midbar. In our level that we are, Hashem can't defeat those people based on our schusim. But it wasn't based on a lack of ability of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, Chas v'Shalom. It was based on the circumstances of our schusim. And then once you do that, then the question is, so what exactly did they do wrong? Maybe they didn't believe in Klal Yisrael. Slabatka dikavar, whatever. So L'maisa, Zat it wasn't really such. They were still tzaddikim, and if they were still tzaddikim, they just did a lot of aveira. So then there's no proof that that koifrim count for a minyan. The third way of deflecting it, which I think is not so likely, but it's worth saying, the Rabbeinu Bechaya has a different girsa, and he says the Gezeir Shava is coming toich from the toich arbim of the brothers of Yosef were toich arbim, and it's toich, nothing to do with Korach, nothing to do with the Meraglim. And the brothers were, once again, 12 brothers, but minus Yosef and minus Binyamin, who wasn't there at that point. And therefore, you're left with 10 brothers. And that's the Makar of Davar Kedusha requiring 10. And the Acha Yosef, they might have done an Aveira, perhaps, but they weren't Kaifrim. So that is his source as to where it's from, and therefore there wouldn't be a proof on Kaifrim. Once again, that's not the accepted Girsa. Okay, so Rav Yashiv happened to says that he likes Rav Moshe's Raya. He thinks it's a good Raya. However, at the end of the day, the halacha is going to follow the Mishnah Berurah and the Pri Megadim. He says, Ramesh has a good raya. I like the raya. In Pshat, I like the raya. He seems to imply if there was no Mishnah Berurah or Pri Megadim, I would go with Ramesh's raya. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to choose Ramesh over the Mishnah Berurah and the Pri Megadim. And by the way, Rav Elyashiv had a lot of respect for Ramesh. You might think sometimes Ramesh was this big makel and Rav Elyashiv was a big machmer, which is true. I once heard somebody told me that when Ramesh was nifter, Rav Elyashiv tore kriya. Even though Rabbi Yashav lived in Eretz Yisrael, Moshe was in America, they didn't have a tremendous personal relationship. Rabbi Yashav said he's a Talmud of the Igros Moshe. So that's what I heard, which I find to be quite amazing. Okay. Now, fine. Now, are Mechallel Shabbos of nowadays treated like a guy in halacha? Because as we said, up until 250 years ago, it was pretty clear-cut. Anybody that left the community was a Mechallel Shabbos for Hesi and Mummer. Everybody who stayed in the community kept Shabbos. That was just the Metzias. So now that we had this, we said also the first generation was obvious. So that the Binyan Tzion, the first generation, they're Mechallel Shabbos for Hesia, they have it in Mummer. The second generation, by the way, the Binyan Tzion, just to speak about who he was the Aruch LaNer. He was the Rebbe of Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. He was in Germany during these early tkufas of the Haskalah. So he saw it, he had front row tickets to see what was going on. So he says the first generation, they have a din of mummer. The second generation, I don't know what to do with them. I don't know what to say about them. On one hand, they're Mechallel Shabbos, but they grew up with this. They don't know that they're doing anything wrong. They didn't rebel against anything. Mummer is a lesson of rebelling. They didn't rebel against anything. They grew up not knowing any better. They treated it like it was heter. They were rebelling to be a Mechallel Shabbos. They were told it's mutter. They lived their life treating things as mutter. And it's a Gemara Makkos that says a oimer mutter has a din of a shogeg. So they have a din of a shogeg, not a din of a mezer. And furthermore, these guys, they make Kiddush Friday night. Apparently that was, in the earliest stages, they didn't throw away everything. They're making Kiddush Friday night. They're saying Zeicha L'Maaseh Bereishis. The whole idea of Mechallel Shabbos, as Rashi explains, why is Chil Shabbos, specifically Chil Shabbos, so bad? It's one Aveir. Why is this Aveir worse than Lashon Hara? There's a lot of people that don't keep Lashon Hara. Why is Mechallel Shabbos worse? Chafetz Chaim, don't listen to it because I'm sure there's a Varden Shmirs, whatever. But simply, why is Chil Shabbos worse? So the reason is because being Mechallel Shabbos is like being koifer b'ma'aseh bereishis. But these guys are saying Kiddush and they're saying Zeicha L'Maaseh Bereishis. So what's going on? I don't know how to treat them. So he says, you know what? These people must be like a Tinok Shenishba of the Rambam when he was discussing the children of the Karaites, whatever. So these must be a Tinok Shenishba. I think the Binyan Tzion was the first one to call these people Tinok Shenishba. And therefore, they do not have a din mummer. And that's how the Binyan Tzion famously paskin. A contemporary, the Minchas Elazar, the Munkatcher Rav, he was strongly opposed to this. He said, what are you talking about? A Tinok Shenishba is somebody that gets kidnapped and doesn't know anything. You think these Haskolaniks in Germany don't know any better? They don't know what's going on. They know what's going on. You can't call them Tinok Shenishba, and he was strongly opposed to it. Rav Hinken in America, he says, us, the American Jews, they don't know any better, so they're a Tinok Shenishba. He was going like the Binyan Tzion. They don't know any better. Relating to the Isser, there's Isser that you're not allowed to hate your fellow Jew who's part of your nation. But the Mummer, the Rasha, you're allowed to hate a Rasha. So, in discussing, are you allowed to, who could you hate and who could you not hate? Rabbeinu Bechaya says that if somebody never got Teichacha, you're not allowed to hate them. You're only allowed to hate somebody who got Teichacha and didn't improve. But if you never got Teichacha, you can't hate them.
He's talking about with a good reason to hate them, besides the fact that...
I don't know. It doesn't seem like you need another reason to hate them besides their rishes. It seems like you're allowed to hate them just for their rishes, Shabbai. Now, the Chavetz Chaim says, nowadays, we don't know how to give techacha anymore. Now, if you would have asked me, stop right here, I would have said, okay, the nowadays we don't know how to give techacha is a nice, like, Musar Sefer thing to write. It's cute for shmooze and all, but it doesn't mean that the Rabbeinu L'Chayos that they didn't get Musar. So they got Musar, maybe they didn't get the perfect Musar. That's what I would have said.
You can still hate it.
Huh? I would think I would think you could still hate them. Meaning a guy who got bad techacha, I would think you could still hate him. That's what I would have said. However, the Chazon Ish says that, therefore, these based on this, the fact that they didn't get techacha, and they don't know any better, so the Chazon Ish says that many chalonim have a din of Tinok Shenishba. Now, sometimes the Chazon Ish is misquoted as giving a blanket rule that everybody is a Tinok Shenishba. He clearly doesn't say that. He clearly says it's a case-by-case study as to what's considered a Tinok Shenishba. Somebody that was never informed and never got techacha, he is a Tinok Shenishba. Somebody that people tried to work on, tried to convince, approached him in a nice, good, proper way and tried to explain to him, and he didn't accept, then he loses his status of Tinok Shenishba. How much is the proper amount of ishtadlus that you have to do for somebody to be considered lose that? So that's in the eyes of the Rabbanan to decide on a case-by-case basis.
Is there also an issue of Tov Shiur?
I was thinking of it. The question was, should we not explain it to them? So it's better that they'll be shegig. I guess it's if you're sure they're not going to accept it, then maybe it's better not to tell them. But if there's a chance that they'll accept it, it probably is better to tell them. That's what I would assume the answer is. Okay. Now, Rav Asher Weiss says, Kfar Hayra Hazakin. The Chazon Ish Paskin, they have a din Tinok Shenishba, they have a din Tinok Shenishba. And we follow the Chazon Ish. That's how Rav Asher Weiss takes on this concept. Rav Yashiv,
In general.
once again, not blanket rule, but the chilonim that haven't had the opportunity to be worked on and explained, etc., have a din of Tinok Shenishba. Rav Yashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman, they say that any chiloni in Eretz Yisrael, even on a kibbutz, does not have a din of Tinok Shenishba. Why? They know about Yiddishkeit. They know that there's from people, they know there's Charedim, they know there's even from people that aren't as intense and they have a kippah sruga in Tel Aviv, and they also keep Shabbos. They know that there's from Jews all over keeping Shabbos. They're not far away. They've met from people in their life. They know the concept, and therefore there's an element of decision on their part not to, and therefore they do not have a din of Tinok Shenishba. Rav Yashiv and Shlomo Zalman were maskim that the Jew from Arkansas, who Bechal has never been acquainted or around from Jews, he does have a din of Tinok Shenishba. And I think just because he went on vacation once to New York and saw two from Jews, I don't think that's enough to say that he loses his Tinok Shenishba stand. But if he's in a society that, if there's a from community in his vicinity, then he might lose it. Rav Moshe says in a similar way, even though Rav Moshe was a very nice man, but Rav Moshe Feinstein says in a similar way that the in-towners, the New Yorkers, don't have a din of Tinok Shenishba. In town, non-from don't have a din of Tinok Shenishba. Out of town, they could have a din of Tinok Shenishba. However, he does say that there's a different point where he says that reform might have a din of Tinok Shenishba, because it's not just that they don't keep, they've been trained wrong, meaning they've been tricked. And it seems like since they've been tricked, they might have a din of Tinok Shenishba because there's a good reason why they believe what they believe, because that's what they were told is correct. But the general not from person who's in town, he for sure does not have a din of Tinok Shenishba, is what Ramosha says.
If, by extension, if secularism and nationalism kind of is taught to replace Yiddishkeit, they wouldn't have the same din as
Yeah, the question being asked is maybe secularism and nationalism, I'll add wokeism, is a replacement for religion, and therefore that's like being told. So we'll see. I'll discuss, maybe Russia Weiss might say that, but the Pashas, no. The Pashas or Moshe would not agree with that, because there's an expectation on somebody that they should seek some level of reason of being on this planet. And so there's an expectation that you should seek out religion in some way. Those that were brought into reform, maybe they are more tricked. Now, I would argue you might not have that heter nowadays. Meaning, if you go back 70 years ago where reform might have been a strong movement and people were more active in the religion, so maybe there's what to be tricked into believing that, this reform is a real deal. I think nowadays, those that are honest see that reform is not holding its weight. Maybe conservative now, maybe still is holding its weight to some minor degree. But reform is simply not holding its weight at all. There's not much there. So I have a feeling Ramesh wouldn't even say it by reform, but it's hard to know. Now, talking about things changing, I was thinking, I once heard somebody make this claim, and I was thinking about it myself also, that maybe when it comes to the Jew from Arkansas, where Moshe said, and Rav Elyashiv and Rosh Zalman, they all pretty much agreed that he had a din of Tinok Shenishba because he was unaffiliated. Nowadays, he might no longer have that din of Tinok Shenishba. Why? He used to be, he didn't have access to information about Yiddishkeit. He didn't have connection. Nowadays, perhaps, he knows he's Jewish, he knows his last name is Goldberg, so maybe he should take out his phone. He could choose whether he likes to go to Google or likes to go to ChatGPT, whichever one he prefers. And maybe he should say, why do some Jews keep Shabbat? Because he knows that much. So it used to be when he was a Jew from Arkansas, what do you want me to do? Go to the library, try to look it up in encyclopedia? That's maybe too much. But now, it takes him 1 minute of his life to look it up. And you do it, and you get to Chabad.com and OU.com and whatever, and it'll explain you a little bit. And maybe a person is chayav to do that, and he can't claim. I'm not saying getting involved in what his din in Shemayim will be, whether he be punished for not doing it or whatever. But to say that he had no way of knowing, he was totally... It's hard. Maybe it's hard to say you have no way of knowing about Yiddishkeit when you are a click away. And I think that's emes. I don't want to say it, but I think it's emes. Rav Asher Weiss rejects this svara, and he says the opposite. He says nowadays, it's not that you're a click away from Yiddishkeit. He says that you have the media who's pushing. It's not like he's more focused on Eretz Yisrael, but maybe he's talking about Arkansas as well. You have the media pushing you, I think it was more Eretz Yisrael, against from this. And since you have the media in your pocket consistently pushing you against from this, you even more of a Tinok Shenishba because of the phone in your pocket. So you could hear the svara both ways. I understand Rav Asher Weiss's svara. I'm personally a little late to the other way, but I hear the svara. Okay. The Brisker Rav and Moshe Sternbach, they didn't hold, similar to the Munkach Rav that we discussed earlier, the Minchas Lazar. They didn't hold to this whole Tinok Shenishba thing. They said, let's face it, the reality is you're not kidnapped. You're Jewish. You could very easily find out a little bit about Yiddishkeit, and they totally rejected the whole concept of Tinok Shenishba, and they say they have a din kigoy l'chol davar. The Marshag speaks about people who would go to shul Shabbos morning, and then they would go to work. Kind of like 100 years later, he was in Hungary, the Marshag, but the Jews in America 100 years later. So they would go to They would go to shul, and then after that they would go to work. Zak the Marshag, they aren't Tinok Shenishba. Because if you're going to shul, you're not a Tinok Shenishba. Sorry, I said the wrong way. They aren't the Mechal Shabbos for Hesia. They have a din of Tinok Shenishba. I said it the wrong way. Sorry. I take that back. Zok the Marshag, they do have a din of Tinok Shenishba, because if they don't, excuse me, not a Tinok Shenishba. Let me rewind. I messed up here. I messed up on this point. Let me take that back. Zok the Marshag, these people do not have a din of Mechal Shabbos for Hesia Mumar. They are Mechal Shabbos. Generally, Mechal Shabbos means that you're koifer in Ma'aseh Bereshis. These guys, even though they are Mechal Shabbos, but over here the Mechal Shabbos for Hesia doesn't translate into Mumar, and therefore they have a din of a Yid. Sorry, that is the Marshag. It's like a Te'avan. But it's interesting because when it comes to Shabbos, we usually don't differentiate between L'Te'avan or L'Hakas. Even L'Te'avan of Mechal Shabbos usually has a din of being koifer b'ma'aseh bereshis, and then you have a din mumar. But Zak the Marshag, these people, it's different. Now there's a story that it was in South Africa, that this guy, I think it was in Cape Town, I believe. There was a young Rav there, and there was a young guy who was about to pass away, and he had no children, and he had one brother who was the type completely off. He was not going to do chalitza. Not happening. So now this young Rav had to figure out what to do. He didn't want this woman to be a guna for her whole life, and she's going to be never get chalitza. So he wanted to have this guy give the get. So he was a young Rav. He doesn't know what to do. So he went to the riff in the back of Gittin, in the back of the Mesetzes Gittin, where they have a model get written. He took out a pen and a paper, and he wrote in regular Hebrew script a get. He copied word for word, and he got two guys from the street to go sign the get. The husband gave it to the wife, and a couple days later he passed away. Now, this Rav brought this get to Reb Chaim Ozer. I don't know whether he sent it, he mailed it, he brought it, I don't know exactly, to Reb Chaim Ozer, and he said, does this work, what I just did? So Reb Chaim Ozer says, well, it's written on paper. Okay, we generally do cloth, but paper's not ma'akev. You can write it on a leaf if you want. We generally write it with whatever dye, whatever, but that's not ma'akev. Regular pen, that's fine. We generally write ksava shiurus, but that's not ma'akev. So you wrote in, maybe the style get is not the exact style that we do nowadays, but it works. It's a shema. It works. The only problem is there's no kosher edim in Cape Town. So the Rav said the two people that signed, they go to shul Shabbos morning and then they go to work. And Reb Chaim Ozer said, based on this binyan siyan and based on this marshag, he relied on those edim and said they're kosher edim and the get is good. The Chelkas Yaakov writes in Shuva, he was asked by his son about this person who apparently was a guest sometimes at their house. He was a Mechal Shabbos for Hesi. He smoked outside on Shabbos, whether he has a din mumar. And the Chelkas Yaakov answered that no, he does not have a din mumar. Why not? Because when I walk down the street, he's embarrassed and he hides his cigarette behind his back. So since he hides his cigarette behind his back, he does not have a din of Mechal Shabbos for Hesi. He's embarrassed. Because if he was a real koifer, he would not be embarrassed from me. Why would he be embarrassed? Because the Rav's here. And the fact that he's embarrassed because the Rav's here shows he's not a real koifer and he doesn't have a din of Mechal Shabbos for Hesi. Even though he smoked a cigarette in public. Now, that seems like quite a chiddush. So the truth is, it's really a din in the Mishnah Berurah. Regarding who's mevatel and erev, the Mishnah Berurah says that someone who's embarrassed to be Mechal Shabbos in front of an Adam Gadol isn't called a Mechal Shabbos for Hesia. So it's a din Mishnah Berurah. And we are going to paskin that way. Now this has tremendous ramifications. Let's start off in Eretz Yisrael. I would venture to say that 95% of Sfardim in Eretz Yisrael would not be Mechal Shabbos in front of Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef. I imagine if Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef was walking down the street in Tel Aviv on Shabbos, every Sephardi guy would quickly take his phone, put it in his pocket, and say, Shabbat Shalom, Harav. Efshar lekabel bracha? Right? That's what 95% of the Sephardim in this country would do that. They would not be Mechal Shabbos in front of Rav Yitzchak Yosef. No way. And being that the case, so therefore I think we could say that 95% of Sephardim would not have a din of Mechal Shabbos for Hesia regarding these halachas. So that is huge. I do not think we could say the same by the Ashkenazi Chilonim. I think the Ashkenazi Chilonim would have no problem being Mechal Shabbos by and large in front of a rabbi. Now, the Lamed Ul says that if most people are Mechal Shabbos nowadays, so being Mechal Shabbos doesn't make you a mummer. A mummer is going to rebel against the tide. If the tide is for Chil Shabbos, you don't have a din mummer. It's an interesting svara, but the Poskim Maisa don't really accept the svara, but it is an interesting svara. The Isha Yisrael says that b'shas tzedchak you count the chaloni for a minyan, because do you have edus that is Mechal Shabbos? Most do not accept. Most of the poskim do not accept the svara either, because if he's a chaloni, then Zanan Sadi is Mechal Shabbos, even if you don't have edim that is Mechal Shabbos. Fine, and especially if he admits that he's Mechal Shabbos. Okay, but the Ish Yisrael says, but Lemais, if he wants to say Kaddish, which definitely happens, if he wants to say Kaddish, then somebody else should say Kaddish with him, because he shouldn't answer to just his Kaddish. And by the way, this could happen. A guy's completely Mechal Shabbos, no sheikhs, but his father was from. So, out of respect for his father, he wants to say Kaddish, because his father told him. His father asked him to say Kaddish, so he wants to say Kaddish for his father, even though he is Choleni. And that really definitely happens. Fine. So let's put everything together, because we gave a lot of svaras, and let's try to get some clarity. So, and see where we stand. So, a person that keeps some things, he makes Kiddush Friday night, very common in Eretz Yisrael Masorati, they'll make Kiddush Friday night, and they'll be Mechal Shabbos. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha like with them? So the Binyan Tzion and the Marshag would say they are not considered a mummer. If they're making Kiddush, they don't have a din of a mummer. Many poskim have relied on this. However, many poskim have rejected this as well. There's been a big split in the poskim on that regard. Now, I don't think that could easily be extended to a Reformed Jew who he keeps things because he goes to shul on Yom Kippur. I think the Reformed guy going to shul on Yom Kippur is part of him being culturally Jewish. Whereas the guy who makes Kiddush every Friday night, it's part of his normal religious practice. So, or the guy who goes to shul every Shabbos morning, that's part of his general religious practice. Whereas like a once a year going, that I don't think that's going to be good enough. But this is what the debate.
So somebody calls himself Masorati, like, it doesn't, that word implies that it's not a religious experience, or maybe not.
I mean, Masorati is literally translated as traditional. Right. But it really means half from. That's what it means. It means half from. And half from, once again, according to the Binyan Tzion and the Marshag, will probably be enough. Ramosha, for example, rejects this svara. And he says that's half from is what we call Mechal Shabbos before Hesia, and that person has a din mummer. So Ramosha clearly rejects that. But that was the mice, the Binyan Tzion and the Marshag go with that, and there are some that want to rely on it. Okay. Now, a Jew, as we discussed, who's embarrassed to be Mechal Shabbos in front of an Adam Gadol, so that Lamaisa, the Mishnah Berurah paskins, that person does not have a din Mechal Shabbos. So we just, in my opinion at least, we just saved almost all the Sfardim. A Jew in Alabama who's not Shomer Shabbos. So according to the Chazon Ish, he is a Tinok Shenishba. He doesn't know better. According to Rav Elyashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman, at their time they said he has a din Tinok Shenishba. Now I agree it's a little bit more debatable whether he still has a din Tinok Shenishba. But once again, I had a svara that he shouldn't. Rav Asher Weiss still says he does. So I think we're going to assume for now he's a Tinok Shenishba, and I think that is the accepted opinion. Fine. A Chaloni in Eretz Yisrael. So the Chazon Ish says if nobody ever worked on him, he has a din Tinok Shenishba. Rav Elyashiv and Shlomo Zalman says since he was exposed, he does not have a din Tinok Shenishba. He has a din of a mummer. Now, someone who went off the derech, he went to yeshivas, and he went off the derech. And I've seen people claim this, and it's just not true. He does not have a din of Tinok Shenishba. I've seen people try to claim he's a Tinok Shenishba. He does not have a Tinok Shenishba. Even if his Rebbe was a really bad Rebbe and did bad things and whatever. Once again, I'm not saying that he's going to be judged in Shemaim and he has no excuses and whatever. I have no idea. That's between him and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether he has excuses and whether he has reasons. But you can't tell me that as a Tinok Shenishba, somebody that had no chance and no sheikhs of knowing, if he grew up in our yeshiva system, there's no way that he had no chance and no sheikhs of knowing. Even if he had some odds stacked against him, potentially, you can't say that he had no chance. I think that's too far-fetched. Fine. Now, let's go over some of those nafkaminas quickly. So, if you need a tenth for a minyan, so you cannot use a kid who went off the derech. It's not going to work. You could use the Sephardi Mechallel Shabbos. You could use the American kid from Arkansas. So Pasha says you could use him. The Ashkenazi Chaloni from Israel, so you probably cannot use him.
Unless he's never been approached ever.
Huh?
According to
According to the Chazon Ish, you would be able to use him if he's never been approached. I'm just saying, Suffolk, whether he fits into that category. Most opinions don't, whatever. I'm not saying that nobody's ever used him. People have used this guy. But I'm just saying it's not simple. How about that? Okay. Now, what about you want to go to some restaurant and you go to the falafel store and who's making the falafel bowls? Or you go to Sefet, the ice cream store, the waffles and the crepes, who's making it? So now, is it a problem? Is there a bishul akam issue in eating that food? So, let's think about it. So if it was a Sephardi guy who was making it, Alpi Roiv, I think we could say that he Alpi 95%. So that won't be a problem, bishul akam. If he's Ashkenazi, so it's not as simple. Because maybe he seemingly does have a din mummer, according to most. But I was thinking, even the Ashkenazi, you probably are fine, because it's really potentially a sveka. There's a machlokes whether the dinim of bishul akam or yayin nesach, for that matter as well, stam yayinim, whether they apply to a mummer, because the isurim, really, the Gemara says in mishum chasanos, to prevent intermarriage. We're assuming that Jewish people, even if they're off the derech, have Jewish children, although that's not always true, but that's the general assumption. So therefore, if they have Jewish children, they might not be the best shidduch in the world, but it's not intermarriage. And if it's not intermarriage, there's debate whether this halacha applies. It's machlokes achronim. So, tzarchin, if the Isser applies, and imtim salomer it applies, maybe they have a din Tinok Shenishba like the Chazon Ish, so there's room to be mekel. I would say by a Sephardi, there's for sure room to be mekel, or the guy who's wearing a yarmulke behind the counter, even though he looks like the type that probably doesn't always wear a yarmulke. But if the yarmulke fits on his head, you understand what I mean, right? If the yarmulke fits like it's on his head, and he knows how to wear it, then the pashtus, it's not an issue of bishul akam, and if he touches the wine, it's not an issue of stam yainim, but I'm not saying you should lechatchila give him the wine to touch. Okay, what about saying lashon hara about a Chiloni politician? That is very halachal ma'asim negea. So I was thinking you probably could. Because first of all, according to the Revel, Yashav Rishon Zalman, Ramosha Camp, they surely are not Tinok Shenishba. And even according to the Chazon Ish camp, these guys are like generally they get it, they're educated, they know what's going on, they're thought out to some degree, even if you don't like the way that they thought. You know what I'm saying? So those guys, B'pashtus, they have a din of a mummer, and you could speak Lashon Hara about them. However, the standard, regular, and by the way, you'd probably be able to hate them as well, but there's a little bit of debate about that, but probably. But the Stam Chaloni guy who's, walking down the street, him, I would say we should be careful and stay away from speaking Lashon Hara against, and we should stay away from hating him. What about giving an aliyah to Mechallel Shabbos? So the Cham Tzvi says, no, it's a Chil Hashem. It's a bizayin to the Torah. It's a great Chil Hashem. Anybody there should get up and make a macha against it. However, the Stipler says you could. Ramosha says, nope, you cannot give him an aliyah. He also goes to that, but Ramosha is a little bit more, not as intense. Ramosha says you could give him psicha or hagba. Psicha or hagba you could give him, but to give him an aliyah, that's a bizayin. I know in a lot of places they are makel to give aliyahs to Mechallel Shabbos. Usually it comes up when somebody's making a simcha, and the Baal Tshuva is making a simcha, and their parent father comes in for the bar mitzvah or whatever, and he's like expecting to get an aliyah. A lot of places are noig to be makel, even though from a halachic standpoint it's really not pashut. So if you could get away with giving him psicha or hagba, that would be the better way to do it. Fine. What about Edis? So Rav Asher Weiss says, even if you're going to hold a Tinok Shenishba, Edis they for sure can't do. They for sure don't have nemanis. Oh, by the way, one thing I wanted to point out, when we're talking about the food that was cooked by this guy, and I just wanted to say it's not bishul akum, you still need to have good supervision on the kashrus. Because even though that Sephardi guy working in the whatever store is cooking that food and I'm saying it's not bishul akum, you still need supervision, and that guy doesn't count because he has no nemanis. So he has no nemanis, but it's not bishul akum. Fine. And by the way, this is going to be a big saving grace, this food thing, because I assume, roiv of the Jewish workers in restaurants in Eretz Yisrael are Sephardi. I'm not going to be stereotypical or whatever, but I think that is true. Fine. I'm not saying that it's overpowering, overwhelming rive, but I think it is a rive. Fine. Okay. Could you be Mechallel Shabbos to save their life? Because it's clear you're not allowed to be Mechallel Shabbos to save the life of a mummer. So l'maisa nowadays we do it anyways. Mishum Eva will save the life of a guy and will save the life of a mummer. But even without that, something interesting. The Chassam Sefer says somebody that jumped off a roof, you bury him like a normal burial, and you do normal velas. Even though there's a halacha that somebody who committed suicide, you don't give him a normal burial because we assume that he did tshuva on the way down. So, Zak the Maram Shek, this mummer who's sick, or trapped below the rubble, or whatever it is that needs to be saved on Shabbos, you could assume with whatever's going on the same thing, that he did tshuva, and therefore you could save him on Shabbos as well. But the Meiser we're going to shave anyways Mishum Eva. There's a Mishnah Berurah that says you're only over the Rabbanan to save a guy Mishum Eva, but you're not over the Raisa to save the guy Mishum Eva. Moshe Feinstein famously says that Mishnah Berurah is a pella. And it's nuts, because that would be putting a whole Klal Yisrael at risk. But to not save a guy to do a deraisa, we certainly Mishum Eva, are over deraisa to save a guy. Mishum Eva, not doing that would put the whole Klal Yisrael at risk. It'd be pikuach nefesh, and many echo the statement of Ramosha and Lamaisa, where Mechallel Shabbos midiraisa to save both a guy and a mummer, Mechallel Shabbos for Hesia, and there's many more examples, but we can't go through them all. Thank you for listening.